Welcome, everyone. Another episode of Chief Speaks for this month of February 2017. February 2017. First slip up of the Gregorian on the year. But of course, I want to welcome you all to this experience that we call Chief Speaks. And on this glorious Sunday dawning, we are dealing with or continuing our discussions around the topic of contradictions. And of course, for those of you who are new to this experience, every month we thematically uncover and disclose some of the lessons that can be found and just some of the maybe base or simple or foundational words and concepts that float around us on a daily basis, even that we haven't really tackled. So last month we dealt with just 2017 as a concept and the things that would be coming forth and are coming forth, and this segment we're dealing with the concept of contradictions. And one of the things that I shared with you all was that coming into the year, that this would be a year of feminine energy, and of course that expresses itself as many things and can take on many different meanings, which of course we'll go into more and more as the days and the months transpire. But one of the things to really take note of and to be mindful of is just the energy and the power of receptivity in this time, and how it becomes ultimately important for us to learn how to listen and use our listening and our observations and even the application of the things that we're being taught as a tool for growth. And before I continue with what we're going to build on today, I want to make a quick addressment to something that is related to actually what we're talking about this month and what we've been talking about in terms of contradictions. There was a show, if I'm not mistaken, last Thursday's community segment, which I caught after the segment. I listened to the archives using the Anu Nation app, because as I told you guys, I actually, if I have to catch the segments late, if I can't get to the YouTube video, I like to listen to it through the app, because it just seems to be smoother in terms of the blog talk playback, but so I checked out that episode, and for those of you who were able to listen in, you probably heard that there was an individual who called in who was very new to the experience and who shared some of their insights and some of their experience in terms of their growth and their learning. And the discussion took some very sharp turns and, went down some very narrow passageways, and the understanding was lost in certain moments and needed to be regained at others. So there was something very interesting there that I wanted to speak on. But prior to that, I want to first commend all of the Anu students and of course, ultimately, Kim, for the way they managed the energy that was being dealt their way in that particular segment. Not to again speak against anyone or to condemn anyone or anything like that, but when you are putting yourself in a public forum to teach and to share, you attract a lot of things, and sometimes we're not prepared to really address or speak to the level of inner frustration that's provoked when certain people begin to come with their issues, whether they be long-standing issues or whether they be issues that are derived in the moment, based on the conversation. Sometimes just in that moment, things come to the surface. And when things come to the surface in that exact moment, everyone has to deal with it as a collective. So that show was very interesting. And I have to admit that even as I was listening to the show, for me, there was a level of annoyance at some of the things that would be being presented by that particular caller. But again, that's part of that was because as the chief of Anu Life Global Ministries, as a chief of Anu Nation, I am always concerned and I'm always observing the mental, spiritual, and emotional welfare of those who have injected and committed and contributed themselves to this work that we're doing as a collective. And when someone comes in and disrupts that in a way that's unhealthy or misrepresents it, or even it's just antagonizing because of the lack of control that they have over their own ego, the Papa Bear in me rises up. So I think it was a good thing that I was not able to actually listen into that segment live, because as I often say, you have to know when not to speak as an instructor and a guide. You have to know when to allow your students and the people who are just being led by you to go through their own process. And like any parent, because the chief is a parent, Baba Lao, you're a father of the mysteries, you're a father of the secrets, but you're a father to the house and the home that people are coming in to learn. So the wisdom of the elder fathers is injected into you when you go through that process. So you could be a very young person, but you have the spirits and the energies of very old people put inside of you, So there's oftentimes, even in this work, I may see someone or work with someone who could be 10 or 15 years older than me, but my affection towards them is like the affection I would have towards a child of mine, when I'm guiding them through something. And that's just the change and the transformation that occurs when you do this work, when you take it on, and when those spirits are put inside of your head. Now, so it led me to a paradoxal, we could almost say a contradiction, a literary or a verbal contradiction that we say often, but it's more of a paradox than a contradiction. But I'm still going to apply it to what I heard in that conversation, or I don't even know if I'd call it a conversation, but just in that discourse. And it's one of the things that we say, where we say, the more you learn, the more you realize how little you really know, because the more you learn and the more you uncover things and rip things apart and dissect them in order for you to gain a greater sense of understanding, what happens is when you do that, the more questions arise in your psyche. So sometimes people are not in tune with that. And I'm going to say it exactly what it is. That individual who called in on the show called in to teach without really recognizing the intellectual and scholarly history of the people that they were calling in to teach. And you always have to be concerned with unsolicited advice. When someone calls into a segment and says, first they start with the accolades. It's sometimes what we call a SHIT sandwich, where, there's compliments on the top, that's the bread. In the middle, it's SHIT, it's a bunch of nonsense. And then it's sandwiched in by some more compliments. So you may get on a call and say, I really like what you all are doing, and this is beautiful and everything like that. You're doing an excellent job, but there's something that we all need to be aware of, because when you start talking about this, you have to think about this, and let us not forget this and that. And then they close it out with saying, well, I just want to thank you for the time for me to just share my perspective. And, so sometimes people think they're really dropping something. They think they're really saying something deep, and they're not saying much at all. And they're not understanding the decency of the people who they're talking to. People are listening to you and asking your perspective, not because they see you as an intellectual or academic authority, but because they're opening up their home to you. And that's what happened on that show, that there was an individual who you could tell is a neophyte, but learn just enough to use certain words and phrases that may speak over the head of the average person, but you're speaking to an Anubian. And the information that we dive into and cut into is at a much deeper level than your average YouTube lecturer watcher, or your average RBGer, or your average let me get the flavor of the day book. So when you, and even if it wasn't that, even if that wasn't the case, coming into a room and assuming that you immediately have something to teach someone, it's like coming onto someone's land and assuming that you immediately need to civilize them. Okay? And if people are patient enough to listen to you and allow you to go through your process of nothingness, then you should be grateful for that. But there was a lot of manipulation there, and that a person even said, well, I feel like I'm being attacked. They weren't being attacked. They didn't answer any question directly, and they were taking a lot of things out of context, and it was sickening. And I started out this whole commentary softly, and I'm going to try to bring it back to that place because I don't want to seem too accusatory, but in my position, I've been doing this a lot longer than many of you who listen to me. And the reason I know that because I talk to many of you. So there are certain personalities that I've been dealing with for over 30 years. And after a while, you get tired of it. You know, especially when you're able to create some level of sacredness in your space. And then you have the same foolishness comes in. People name dropping and, you know, not really understanding what it is that they're talking about and being offended by the fact that they've now they've stepped in mess and don't know how to get themselves back out of it. So when you have someone who comes in a room and immediately begins to go on this diatribe about all they know, and they're only trying to impress themselves with relays of their own consciousness, and then you ask critical questions, which now reveals that possibly you know more than they do, they start to get nervous and sometimes even defensive, like that individual did, and then tried to make it well, you know, this doesn't have to be a Yoruba against a Kemet thing. No one said anything to that effect. And in fact, what was said before that statement was that we deal with all the sciences. But because that person didn't have enough tools, they had to keep coming back to these type of things, those type of weak responses. And, you know, a lot of times when you hear me say things like, a lot of times it's not that your family is so unconscious that they don't want to deal with you. Sometimes you're just a jerk. That was a great example of it. So now this is a person who can go on to social media after that phone call and say, yeah, you know, I was trying to teach these people over here, but they were stuck on the Orisha stuff, or they're stuck on different levels. You know, no, it wasn't that. You were rude. You didn't properly analyze the context of the people who you were speaking to. And then you were taking things so far out of context that we know you're dealing with more emotion than logic. And I don't even want to say what that means, but there's deeper implications there, you know. And there was even some verbal manipulation that individual started to play with. So, you know, like I said, I commend because it was Dietrich who called in and had to kind of bring some structure. Kim, of course, and Anwar was on the line. And I could tell there was a moment where they all kind of just said, okay, you know, and just kind of let it go. But there was even an example that was given that was very disrespectful. And I'm going to show you where Kim had used the term Ashe, and a question was being asked about pyramids. You know, well, let's talk about the necessity of why the pyramids were built, which of course this person couldn't answer. So they started on this circular defense, and they said, well, you know, if you talk to someone who was a lot less enlightened than you are, they would probably say, well, why are you talking about Ashe? So what they were doing in a slick way, where they were comparing their study of Kemet and what they called walking in a Kemetic priesthood and they were comparing that, making a comparison and putting that on an escalated level to Yoruba sciences or Orisha or Ifa sciences, and then making another level where you drop down, or comparison where you drop down another level to someone who's not enlightened. So speaking like the Kemetic sciences are on the top and you can't understand it. And then now we have Ifa, and the relationship I have with you is similar to the relationship that you might have to someone who's completely unenlightened. See, this is a person who doesn't even understand the correlation between Nigeria and the Nile Valley civilization. This is just where we talk about dead consciousness. You know, individuals who would invest it in dead consciousness for the sake of title, for the sake of name, and are looking to impress. And one of the paradoxes, or again, the contradictions that we often find, similar to the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know, is the more you seek to impress people, the more you fail at impressing people. You see, so when you're coming into a situation, and again, you're name dropping, or another favorite one is where people like to use different languages that they assume people in the room don't understand. And they'll say those languages without interpretation to now separate themselves and to create an abstraction of themselves, to say, well, I'm dealing with something different over here. Let me say Hotep. Let me say Dua. Let me say Seneb. Let me say these words that you probably don't know, without really, again, making a proper assessment of what's going on in the room. You know, you don't know who you're speaking to. So you trying extra hard, and really that's not necessary. So you end up losing what could be there in terms of people truly being impressed by you. And the problem is, when they're not impressed by you, then now your fear kicks in. And that's another contradictory paradox where it deals with fear. You know, and I've spoken about this before, not only in the spiritual training, but in the show Fear. Typically, the more afraid you are of something, the more you should actually do that thing. You know, when you have we have healthy fears, and of course, then we have what we call phobias, which, you know, usually are some form of an irrational fear. But think about even something as simple as approach anxiety. Some people are afraid to approach other people, so they become very isolated and they avoid people. And a lot of times when they seek out help, one of the things that they have to do is learn how to approach people, the very thing that they're afraid of. So going into a space and being afraid of not being able to impress, being afraid of not being the smartest one in the room, one of the things that you can do to get through that and over that is to acknowledge that maybe I'm not going to impress the room. Maybe I'm not going to be the smartest person in the room. Maybe this is an experience for me to learn. But you close yourself off from that when you forget the consistent paradoxical contradiction that the more you learn, the more questions will arise. The more you learn, the more you realize the less you know. You see, but when you're afraid of that reality, you turn that into the more I learn, the less I need to know. You see, so that individual had that type of mindset. And then, you know, I don't want to get too much in it because I don't want to seem like I'm what I'm really doing in this moment is I'm tipping my hat to the Anu students for their patience in that, not necessarily condemning that individual, because everyone has to go through a transformative journey, and everything that I'm talking about is related to what I'm talking about today. And it's all about the contradictions, and sometimes the more afraid we are of something, the less we're afraid to enjoy something else. The more you're afraid of being wrong, the less you'll really be able to enjoy righteousness. The more afraid of death you are, the less you'll be able to enjoy your life. You see, the more you're afraid of taking in new knowledge or new information, the less you'll really be able to gain the understanding and the comprehension of the information and knowledge that you do have. So it's a contradictory paradox in that sense. I want to read a quote, but before I do, I want to share something real quick too. For readings, go to askosiris.com, askosiris.com. If you want to join my class, go to saduluhouse.com, saduluhouse. Now, let me go back to Osiris, Ask Osiris for a moment. You have to schedule through that form. Do not send an email saying, I want to get a reading. Schedule through the form. If you don't schedule through the form, you get no reading. That's the way it works, okay? Readings and the work that I do, or that anyone does, is but primarily me, is an offering to the community. And the offerings that are paid for the readings go right back into the community. Right back. For those of you who've ever got readings from me in person, you know this firsthand, because you notice I don't touch the funds, and there's a certain place I make you put the money. My hands don't even touch it. Okay. So, in order for me to continue to provide that service, I would only will that you follow the protocol that's been placed in front of you. We cannot create a different system based on your unwillingness to respect the protocol that's been put in front of you. All right. So I kind of I'm giving the site addresses again, because of course we're still getting emails. How do I join your class? How do I sign up for a reading? Now, that information we put in every single description of every show. We've been doing that for years. For readings, go to. For classes, go to. The information is right in front of your face. Even on the screen, on the videos, we have links to the websites. I don't do that because I'm on some marketing campaign to sell readings or to sell classes. I do that to limit the amount of emails and phone calls that we get asking, where do I go for a reading? How do I sign up for your class? And I know I didn't always do that in the past because it felt a little tacky just to always have all over the place. For readings, go here. For readings, go. It just felt like a little bit too commercial. And this is not a commercial experience. Okay. However, when people ignore those things or try to, again, create their own system, they end up creating, you end up creating more work for us. And when you create more work for us, in fact, you end up costing me, because then I have to pay to put systems in place or people in place to accommodate the extra work. Okay. So now it turns into something else, which it shouldn't be. So that's primarily the piece with that. And I wanted to share that, again, in the description of every show. And I'm only saying this now because I know that we get new watchers and listeners every show. And I'm making a point also to say it in the middle of the show for those who dial out before the end, because normally I share this information at the end. So I'm going to put it in the middle. Readings, Ask Osiris. Classes, saduluhouse.com. For Osiris Life, for monthly services, osirislife.com. Okay, those are the places that you go. I welcome people. You can tweet me if you want to send me a DM or mention me in a tweet. If you want to, in Instagram, follow me and send me a DM. That's fine. Some I can get to, some I can't. But if you tweet me or DM me telling me you want to get a reading, what should you do? It's going to get ignored. Okay, so I'm telling you now. So for everyone who's gotten because I've gotten quite a few of those, I want to join your class. What do? I ignore it, because if you do not have the wherewithal to at least read the description of the shows or listen to the commercials in the beginning of the shows that we always play all the time, saying for classes, go here, for this, that, or look on the screen and see the links, then you're going to have if you don't have the wherewithal to do that, at least you're going to have a lot of trouble in my class. And I also know that if I do a reading for you, you're not going to listen to me. So it's going to be a waste of both of our times. If you don't have it, at least the minimal ingenuity and get up and go it takes to actually see that, because we plaster it all over the place. If you don't have at least that, then you're going to have a problem. So again, there's no restrictions on DMing me, through Instagram or Twitter or anything like that. But if you try to get a reading or a dream interpretation, for that, it takes my energy and my time. You have to get schedule an appointment for that. Okay. I'm not the doctor who's going to give you a checkup in the middle of a party. Or you're going to see me in the supermarket and have me, doing chiropractic services over the produce section. You have to come to the office to get that done. All right. So I just want to put that out there. Not everyone has been doing it, but it kind of comes in waves, so it's like when new people start to come tune in and listen, then we have to kind of reiterate it again. All right. So with that little bit of housekeeping, I'm going to share a quote from the Dalai Lama, where he says, "We have bigger houses, but smaller families, more conveniences, but less time. We have more degrees, but less sense, more knowledge, but less judgment, more experts, but more problems, more medicines, but less healthiness. We've been all the way to the moon and back, but have trouble crossing the street to meet the new neighbor. We built more computers to hold more information, to produce more copies than ever, but have less communication. We have become long on quantity, but short on quality. These are times of fast food, but slow digestion. Tall man, but short character. Steep profits, but shallow relationships. It is a time when there is much in the window, but nothing in the room." Okay, so I'm not going to do a breakdown of that quote, but I felt it was significant based on, again, what I witnessed from that Thursday show. It was it speaks to that. And what I witnessed a lot, and kind of even the same paradox. You want to be a seeker, you want to be a priest, you want to help people, but you too lazy. I gotta say it. You're too lazy to even Google Chief Yuya reading. You want all of this personal service because, again, you think that human beings become apps to you. So you lose the humanity, the humanism in terms of how to communicate, how to touch, how to respect someone's protocol. And again, this is all about the paradox of these different contradictions. It's very similar to the way people sometimes ruin relationships. If you have someone who has trust issues, which is a common thing, that's someone you can't trust. Because someone with consistent and chronic trust issues will always create a situation in their relationships where, and I spoke about this on the four signs of self-sabotage. I think I did that show last year, like around January, February of last year. But the 4 signs of self-sabotage. So when they feel that they can't trust anybody, they become a person who can't be trusted. They sabotage any relationship that one would be able to have with them. It's a cyclical syndrome, and that's their way of protecting themselves before someone hurts them who, subconsciously or even consciously, they don't trust. You see, so there's like so many very interesting, contradictory, again, paradoxes that we live out, even in terms of being students. You want to be a student, but you don't respect being taught, or you don't respect the process of being a student. My middle name is Talib. That's what the T is, and T, Asan Anu, Haru, Yuya, T, Asan Anu. Talib means a seeker. Some will say the student, but the truth is seeker and student are synonymous with one another. You see, so that's why when I get certain type of messages, I ignore them, because I know I'm not talking to a seeker. If I'm not talking to a seeker, I'm definitely not talking to a student. I'm talking to someone who wants to be babied and spoon-fed and handheld, And that's not what we do here. In fact, that's one of the sickest things to ever do at all, because it brings out the worst form of longing inside of a person. And I'm going to explain what that means a little bit. But yeah, it's just time for transformation, and it's time to be able to see some of these dysfunctions and sicknesses that so many walk with, and learn how to avoid and sidestep them. And again, proud of the students Thursday for allowing the space for some of the nonsense to fizzle out on its own. You know, sometimes coming with the hammer is not always it's not always the solution. But, you know, like I said previously, you have to learn to have an unconditional love affair with your learning. And so many people do not have an unconditional love affair with anything. Just like in relationships, often the love that people project or assert or proclaim towards another, it's not conditional. The love itself is just a statement generated based on the new conditions that the person makes them feel inside, or invokes inside, or the feelings that they make that person make them feel. You see, put your hand here, touch me here, look at me this way, you know, things like that. So you're making that person generate that particular stimulus inside of you, and in that, then you say, okay, I love you. And if I say I love you, then now that should make you now generate more stimulus. See, it's all based on condition. It's not unconditional. So the same thing in people's learning. A lot of times people are learning certain things because they want to generate a feeling inside of themselves, and they want their learning to have that type of two-way reaction or two-way engagement with them. And of course, it's very difficult when you're just reading a book or you're watching a video or something like that. So what they do now is they go into an environment or a group of people, and they seek for that same confirmation of stimulus from that person. I want to feel love. I want to feel adored. I want to feel respected and recognized. So I'll go into this environment and become a teacher. But how many people go into an environment to do something not based on their sincere desire to do that for the people? So, you know, how many people become teachers because they want the summers off? Not necessarily because they want to protect and guide minds. How many people go into medicine because they truly have a desire to heal and help people? How many people just go into medicine because the money's good, or because it's a prestigious career? How many people go into law because they really want to educate people on their rights and advocate the culture and the morality of the actual country that they live in? How many people go into it because of that, or go into it because, again, it's prestigious and they can make a lot of money? You see, these are the contradictions and the paradoxes that we have to look at, and we always have to try to look at the backstory. Even when it comes to consciousness, for many, their pursuits of consciousness and education are based on their hate for something else. Like the young man who called in, and I can say young man because he's younger than me. He said he was 30 something. But the young man who called in, he kept talking about the Yoruga and the European, and the Yorugu, and the European this and the European that and the European this and that, while still portraying some of the same attributes of what he was speaking against. Oftentimes, the things that we despise and the things that we protest against the most, you know, through what we find despicable, are the very traits within ourselves that we're trying to avoid the most. You see, and this is a old adage. You know, we've known this for a long time. You know, so sometimes, like, you know, it's kind of like in Shakespeare, the woman protest too much, or the queen protest too much, doth protest too much. But you know, I mean, in a very simple sense, you have the Freudian concept of projection, you know, where people project their own dysfunctions and character defects onto others. But it's a very real thing, and you could clearly hear it in that call. all of the arrogance and the viciousness and the defensiveness and the insecurities that you spoke about and against and another people, you displayed in that exact moment, revealing that you don't truly have an unconditional love affair with your learning, but in fact, it is truly based on condition. And, again, as a neophyte, and I can tell this is a person who's, they may think they got some years in, but they don't. There's a lot to learn and a lot to grow on in that. But we're speaking about contradictions, of course, right? And again, I'm not trying to rip this person apart. I want to make that very clear. But what I am is I'm pointing out the things to identify when they're occurring, because sometimes we get caught in the mix, even with our family members, because we don't have the language to use when certain things are being said to us. Like when he said, well, I've been attacked since I've been on this phone call. That was a lie. But sometimes when people begin to play the victim role and we're speaking logically, and they start speaking very in a circular fashion, and they start playing the victim role, we get stuck. We don't really know what to say. And that's the purpose of a person doing that, because we won't know what to say when they start playing the victim and using emotion and irrationality when we're speaking sanely and rational to them. If you say, well, let's stop living in the past so much. Let's really look on improving what our ancestors did. And you say, well, this isn't a Orisha verse Kemetic thing. No, that has nothing to do with what was just said to you. Now you're making things up because you can't address what's being said to you, because you're so crystallized and stuck in your very weak and hollow perspective. You don't know as much as you think you do. You just got a bunch of words, but you don't really understand the essence of those words, nor do you understand the essence of those ideas that are being shared with you. So you're stuck. So anything that's said to you, you're going to become defensive. And at some point you realize this is a waste, because this is a person that's not transforming through unconditional love, but is crystallizing themselves through the desire for stimulus. So you call this show, you don't know anything about it, but you pretend like you do by getting on and saying, well, when we're talking about traditional African thing, that's really not even what the title of the show was about. That's not even what we were talking about. So that's just your template cover letter that you say when you call every show. That's a template that you send out to each employer. I would be happy for the opportunity for this job. I'm a hard worker. It's your generic template, but you're not really studying the company that you're applying for. Has anyone ever done that when you applied for a job? I know I used to, when I used to work for people. I studied those companies before I went in the interview, because that's always impressive. You tell them how much they made last year. You tell them about any new divisions that they opened up and things like that, or things that are going on in their R&D department, research and development, that they may not have made so public. People are impressed by that. But when you just come in assuming that whatever the skill set that you have is going to be impressive and needed in that particular environment, you come off as a jerk. But that's because you're crystallized and your conditional sense of love for what it is that you're doing, or a conditional sense of love for your people. So you even have a crystallized perspective of who and what your people are and who and what other people are, because you don't recognize that unconditional love is transforming. So all things on the planet have the potential to transform and to change. That is a characteristic of the human condition. That's why another contradictory paradox that we say often is that the only constant in life is change, right? It's an interesting paradox. The only things that stays the same is the fact that things don't stay the same. That's a part of the human condition. But I want to read a story to you all. I haven't done that in a little. Well, I have actually. I did recently. I think I shared a story. But speaking about the condition of love, and some of you may be very familiar with this story because it's of course it's an old one, but it was published a very long time ago, along with a larger collection of stories. But I'm gonna read it. Why Children Belong to the Mother. It's the title of the story. Why Children Belong to the Mother. There was once an animal called a Jim, which had two sons named Obegud and Igwe. They lived in the forest near the home of a poor man and wife who had 12 children. One day, these parents left their children at home and went to their farm. While they were away and the children were singing and playing together, the wicked beast, Ejim, heard their voices. She sent her son, Obegud, to their home to say that he had something to sell. The beast did so, and the children asked him to show his wares. As soon as he had succeeded so far in attracting their attention, he went back singing a song to let Ejim know that all was well. Now in this copy, I don't have the song, but I know the song. The song was Obegud, Obegud, ayayae, Bia koko ayayae, Ajima anwa ayayae. Okay, because just know that all stories, we don't really say stories, we sing stories back home. Okay, but anyway, so like I said, as soon as he succeeded so far in attracting their attention, he went back singing a song to let Ejim know that all was well. Obegud, ayayae, Bia koko ayayae, Ajima anwa ayayae. Ejim then rushed to the home and stood outside of the gate, a fearful sight. Then she thrust out her long, sharp claws, seized the child, and carried it off to her den in the woods. On their return from work on the plantation, the parents missed one of their children. They heard from the others that a monster with a very long mouth had killed him and carried him off. Long they wept for their lost child, and when the time came to go to the farm the next day, the father bade his wife go alone while he waited at home to catch Ejim. At first the woman would not go, but after a while her husband persuaded her. So she left him and went on. At noon the beast sent out her other son, Igwe, telling him to say what his brother Obegud had said the day before. He did so, and again the children asked him to bring out his wares. He then ran homeward, singing as he went another song as a sign to Ejim that all was well. When Ejim heard this, she again came out to take one of the children. She came to the gate as before. The man was well armed, but at the terrible sight of the beast, he lost his courage. He ran for his life through the forest. He left his children helpless before the greedy monster Ejim. Ejim then seized another child and carried it off to make a great feast of it. When the mother returned and learned that a second child had been taken, she was heartbroken. With her eyes filled with tears, she turned fiercely on her husband and asked why he had not saved the child. To cover up his cowardice, he told her that he had become suddenly sick and he had to leave the infants for a while, and during his short absence, the monster had come and had taken another. The children, however, all cried out, "No, mother." Father fled in terror at the sight of the animal and left us to face the danger alone. The mother was angry at him for his cowardly act and drove him away. He did not need to be told a second time. He went out and hid himself in the woods nearby. The mother said she would risk her life to save her children. She got a very sharp sword and waited for the beast, which came again as before, and thrust her head through the gate to seize a child. Then the woman took courage, faced the danger, and killed the beast. The children gave loud shouts of joy. The father, who had heard all of this, came from his hiding place in the hope that all danger was then over. Obegud and Igwe, the two sons of Ejim, however, had heard the noise of the struggle and now rushed out to the aid of their mother. When the man saw these other two monsters, he ran back to his hiding place, but the woman held her position and was not afraid. She saved her children and killed the two beasts. When the mother had finished the fight with the beast, out came the worthless husband from his hiding place and asked for a knife. that he might divide the flesh of the beast between himself and his wife. The best of the flesh he kept for his share, and gave the heads only to the woman who had saved the children and had slain the beast. To this the mother of the children refused to agree. She called upon Master Obasi to decide between her husband and herself, to whom did the flesh of the beast belong. Obasi heard her cry and sent a messenger to bring them before him. When they arrived, the wife stood forth, bowed, and said, "After promising to fight Ejim and protect our children, my husband ran away and left them for the monster to kill. I am the one who stood forth fighting and slew not only the beast, but also her 2 young. Yet my husband desires to give me only the heads of all these animals. I come then to claim my right before our master." Obasi then asked the husband what he had to say in defense of taking such a large share, but he could not dispute what his wife had said. It was clear to Obasi that the wife had the brave heart to defend her children when their father had fled in fear. Obasi scolded the husband for deserting his children. He then gave order that from thenceforth no man should claim any property which his wife has risked her life to get. Obasi also said that should the wife choose to take the other 10 children away from her husband, she should be permitted to do so, for she had suffered much for their sakes. A woman is sure to risk her life for her children, though there are but few men who will do so. It is because of this decision that when a woman leaves her husband and returns to her parents, she may be forced to give up all the gifts received from her husband, but not her children, nor any other thing for which she may have risked her life. Okay, so that story reveals to us something about the transitory energy of love. And of course, in this particular region, and we're speaking about, because many of you may be able to, I'm thinking by now, find that story, or at least a portion of it. I heard it orally. That story comes out of southern Nigeria, from the Ejagyam people, and also called the Ikoi. And it's kind of like close to Cameroon. They migrated out of Cameroon into that space. But there are different versions of that same story. And in one of the stories, the husband actually kills the beast. So depending on what's being expressed, or the idea that's being expressed, you will find different variants of the same exact story per se. But ultimately, what it's about is the transitory nature of this thing that we like to call love. And those stories that you get, again, from the Ejagyam or the Ikoi, they have a lot of, they're storytelling people, again, because again, you're dealing with an oral culture. And even it's very interesting story about how they came out of Cameroon into the region that we would call like, I always tell you guys I'm not good with maps, but it's like southeast Nigeria, because it's south, but it's leaning a little bit more off the coast going towards the east. But coming out, it's very interesting stories about even that passage, into that space. But like I always tell you, when you're dealing with the stories of our Egun, the stories never begin in the beginning. We're so used to linear storytelling in this culture here, but over there, sometimes the story begins in the middle, it begins at the end and works its way backwards. It's a different way of thinking. For instance, Ejim itself. Ejim is like, when you barbecue and you have that long, I don't even know what it's called. It's like a fork, but it only has 2 prongs on it. or two forks on it, and they use that to turn the meat over and things like that. Back home, they call that the ejim, and they use that in the soup and things like that to pluck the meat and pull it out. So when they speak about that beast ejim, it has the fangs like that fork. So one thing means many other things in many different systems and many different other cultures. But again, we're speaking about the transitory nature of things. So two people getting married and claiming an unconditional love for one another, and of course an unconditional love for what one another produces, can change when challenged by the frailty of the human condition. So when one has to face the ego, and the ego is always going to present the possible loss of life, the possible fear of death, or ultimately again the fear of loss, then a lot of times what we consider to be love for us doesn't survive or doesn't have the ability to transcend that frailty of the human nature. Oftentimes we're so afraid to be born into death. And who knows, maybe as ancestors, we're afraid to be born into life. Because no matter how you look at it, you want to look at it as things ending, but no matter how you look at it, things are beginning. It's a birth, no matter what way you look at it. When we come into this world, we're born into this world. When we leave this world, we're born into the Duat, or we're born into the land of the Egungun. But no matter what, we're always being born into something, you see. But our fascination often with the loss of something doesn't embrace the new birth. It only embraces the crystallization that we consider the death to be. Everything will stop as I know it. So sometimes that fear transcends the human quality of love, because often what we consider our love to be, or our ideology of love, again, love for us is a trigger. So someone says they love us, or we say we love them, it's only active as long as the trigger of pleasure is there. And once we lose those triggers, or a person reaches their limits of being able to provide the triggers that we demand, then we question the love. Or often what we end up doing is we betray the love because the trigger is no longer in place. And this is when you see the damage, the perversion, and the distortion of Oshun. Oshun being, again, the unconditional, primal, and energetic attachment. It's not based on condition. It's not based on your feelings. Okay? It's based on a more primal instinct to be born through attachment and transformation into something else. And that real love changes you. I've shared that in works as well, but love is a transformative force. It changes those who touches it. So it can change you and birth you into a higher reality when it's true love. But if it's the crystallization idea and egoic attachment of what we want love to be, then it will crystallize you into your more humanistic nature. And sometimes the desire or what we're picturing can't transcend that humanistic nature. The human nature is very powerful, and 9 times out of 10, your love is not going to transcend it. This is why people fall in love, if we want to use that term, and fall out of love, or people marry and divorce. People love their children, then they love their children less. Like you see in the example in this story, people will have children, and one may have a different kind of love for those children than another one. You see, because the human condition is ever changing. So when you base and build your relationships around love, or your perception of love based again on your human thinking, your situation is challenged from the onslaught. It's challenged because that perception and the stimulus of love is going to change. Because again, when it's conditional, it's based on stimulus. So when it's stimulus, you don't make me feel this way anymore. You don't say this to me anymore. You don't touch me like this anymore. Touch me like that. You don't look at me like this. Look at me like that. You don't love me. Because see, often when we're saying that we love someone, again, often we're doing it from ego because we're expecting a certain response, which will then trigger a stimuli. Because why else say it? We say, well, I want the person to know. The person should know because love exists underneath human thought and human nature. You're saying it because it's a word trigger. There's a formula that you invoke in saying it when you mention the term love. There's another story that relates to this that I'm not going to share the whole story, but if anyone ever wants to understand or read about the stories of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, very quickly, you have a similar situation where in this particular tale, Akhenaten, this is when Akhenaten dies, and Akhenaten was basically not the, you know how we say like, oh, you have only a face a mother could love, and things like that. He had some challenges in terms of his health and his physicality and things like that. And Nefertiti loved him tremendously, despite of. She had an undying love for him and basically said, I would love you for the rest of my life. And she became, in many senses, the deified idea of the love that would be shared between man and woman. And when Akhenaten died, she even joined the mourners, because you had, like we say, professional mourners or designated criers at the actual entombment services. I'm giving you the long story short. So during the time that when Akhenaten died, she said that, I will love this man and I vow to love him. She said this publicly, and I will stay in this same place of mourning for the next 100,000 years, and because unless the Nile changes its banks, I will always love this man. Okay, so that's like saying, just so you can understand, it's almost like saying, if the sun, the sun, in the northeast rises in the west, then I will change my mind, even though it's never done that, right? So she gained the admiration and the respect of all of the women of the land, and all of the men and the women of the land. And one of the head priests, one of his wife, one day was going to get water from the river, and she witnessed Queen Nefertiti throwing these large stones and rocks into the river, into the Nile, making basically a big pile. Essentially, she was changing the banks of the Nile, you see. And she was very upset about this. She went home, she told her husband, and her husband was there having dinner with some of his other priestly friends. And, he said, well, listen, love does not transcend humanity. And the only thing that exists are the two faces of Khepra. Now, I did a breakdown on Khepra before, but Khepra is transformation. That's the archetype of transformation, the archetype of change. So you have the only thing that, again, it goes to the only thing that stays the same is change. So everything is going to change, even though this woman said, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it forever. So long story short, the woman got upset. And she said to her husband that, you owe us an apology because you had us put this woman on this pedestal, basically, and represented the undying love of what a woman is to have for a man, right? And basically, she's a fraud. So it was primarily the women of Akhet Aten. And Akhet Aten means it means it's the place of the sun, or the city of the sun. All right. So like all the women in this place were they were upset because they're saying, you put this woman forth to us as the model, and she's not the model. And in many senses, she's a fraud. So now Nefertiti became like the model of frustration, of feminine frustration. And so the husband said, well, what would you prefer her to do? Because if she really was honoring the man, she would have sacrificed herself to his soul when he died. Because that's the true devotion. She would have killed herself when her husband died, sacrificed herself to his soul, and would have remained by his side in the duat. So, there are many ways that a woman could show that measure of devotion. Again, we're basing it on this culture, and I'm telling you a story. So before someone says, you telling me I need to kill myself, please. So again, she was upset. So the husband said, okay, no problem. Long story short. So he decides to test her. This is a test that he does. One day the woman comes by. The woman's in her house. One of his priest friends comes by and says, you need to come with me. Your husband just died in the temple, right? And basically the husband pretended like he was dead. And so the woman, long story short again, because there's more to this, but she goes into mourning and she's crying and she's wrought with pain. And, there's a 90-day period of mourning that a person is supposed to go through. So the friend of her husband, the priest friend, was like, well, listen, you shouldn't be alone at a time like this, and you should be comforted and so forth and so on. So he said, even if I have to stay here every day, I will come here and make sure that you're okay. So he does that. And then after a period of time, 30 days, in fact, 30 days, he says, listen, you shouldn't be alone. Let's get married. It's time for you to move on with your life. So the woman agrees. She says, yeah, she said, I do need to think about my future. And she says, let's get married. So he said, okay, from this point forward, consider us engaged, right? Which also lets you know that we had marriage in our ancient rites. But anyway, it's another story. So one night he's like, all right, I'm gonna come by and, hook up a plate. So she makes like this really nice feast. She goes into a cave where her husband, her dead husband, quote unquote, kept the wine like for special occasions. It was a cave where he hid it, and she brings out the wine. She puts on silk and fine cotton, and the priest comes by. They're eating, and then he grabs his chest and he says, basically like, I'm having a heart attack. I'm dying. And she was like, no, I just lost a husband. You can't die on me too. So then he says, okay, the only way that I'll be able, it's my heart. The only way I'll be able to live is that if the nose of someone who just died exactly 30 days ago touches my chest. But I don't know anyone who just died 30 days ago. And then the woman says, my husband, he just died exactly 30 days ago. I'm going to go to the entombment place, or what they call the House of Life back in those days. Because that's where the House of Life is where they did the entombment and embalming, in Kemet. But she runs in there. She said, okay, she grabs a knife and she said, I'm going to cut his nose off and bring it back to you. So she runs into, the House of Life. She looks through all the bodies and she finally finds her husband's body. He was covered in a cloth shroud. And right when she goes to cut his nose, he opens up his eyes. And like he sadly looks at her and he says, if you think that it was treasonous for Nefertiti to change the banks of the river, how much more treasonous is it for you to try to cut off my nose? So the moral of the story essentially is that love is beautiful. Love is awesome. Love feels great, but it's subject to the human frailty because all things change and all things transform. So love being such a powerful force that exists throughout dimensions, one of the very few forces that can transcend dimensions, dimensional gaps. That's why you can dream and have great feelings of love for your ancestors, and then in your waking world and waking life have such great feelings of love for the people around you. Love transcends to varying dimensions, but even through those dimensions of astral travel, you're still relating to those entities and forces through your human condition or through your human nature. And the human nature is a very frail thing. Despite the amount of things that you learn or claim to learn, it's still subject to the conditionality of the human condition. So to build anything upon our love as we perceive it in our human mind, it can be great. It could be wonderful stimulus. It can be even beautiful. But ultimately, it changes. It's going to change, because once it begins to cease to serve us, it will change. No different than once Nefertiti realized, wait a minute, he's not here anymore, and I want something else. So she said, but I made a pledge publicly that I will stay in this place until the banks of the Nile change. I'll just change the banks of the Nile. And the same thing with the woman saying, that was disgusting. She should have this undying love for her husband. And the husband saying, the trick that he played on her was to teach her. He's saying, okay, you don't understand. Even your love will change for me. So that's why he decided to do what he did in that particular story. All things change. And that is a part of the paradox of life. All things change. Okay. And that is the constant of life. And when we're open to that change and that ebb and flow in the multiple or the two faces of Kepra, then we're able to ride and enjoy the different facets that change. Some things live, some things die. Some things grow, some things don't grow. And the same thing goes for relationships. And when you see the futility, or really the utility of the relationships that you have with people begin to change, you can make clear and responsible decisions as to if you want to continue forward in that relationship, or if you want to change the terms and conditions of the relationship. Because ultimately, no matter what you confess to another individual, it still has the potential for change. You see, it's still malleable. Even if you say, I love you with all my heart, I love you forever. Well, what does that really mean? Because as I transform and change and my condition changes, my perception for love is going to change, and I'm going to attach myself to new entities, new forces, new ideas, new concepts, and even new people. So the promises that I made 5 years ago may not be applicable today. So I have to learn how to change and move with the ebb and flow of the movement of Kepra, or the ebb and flow of, remember, Kepra is transformation. So as things transform and transmutate, I have to learn how to create a new set of desires and wants and enjoyments based on that. You see. And for some, this seems like a contradiction. And perhaps it is. Perhaps this is one of the inconsistencies of life that allow for the push and pull and the electromagnetic interplay to keep life going forward. You look at the Kepra, the dung beetle, it pushes its own dung and plants its eggs for new life inside of its excrement. That which is old and behind it and would seem wasted it now helps to bring forth new life. The nature and the context of things require and demand change. So absolutely, why do we need a pyramid today? And is the pyramid the shape that we need today? Or is it something else? Because my nature of relationship with the cosmos has changed based on the moments, even if it was a millisecond, but the transitory moments that I have experienced unconditional love. It's changed and transformed me. So now my work has to change and transform based on that. If not, I crystallize and hold myself down to a ceiling that is really only based on my fear of being birthed into a new world. No bueno. Okay. Thank you all. This has been Chief Speaks. Make sure that if you're not a member of the Anu Spiritual Training, that you do sign up and you do join and become a part of the Anu Spiritual Phase 1 Challenge, so you can get through it. Let's see what June looks like when we come into that summer solstice. Let's see how we're standing, how strong we're standing. And I'm going to say this too, for those of you who've been studying and with us and riding with us and loyal to these shows, as I promised you back in maybe 2010, 2011, when I started doing these segments, the things I'm going to show you, people who have been studying for 10, 15 years haven't even began to scratch the surface of them. I told you that. And the same thing with Grasping the Divine Power. Quick read, deep read. Our new spiritual training, very accessible, easy to get into. It will change your entire world. So sometimes when you have, I'm saying that to say, sometimes when you have conversations with people who claim that they have all of these certifications and accolades behind them, you may surprise yourself at how much further ahead of them you actually are, and you didn't realize it, because you might say, well, man, I've only been studying with Chief for 2 years or for 3 years. Well, when you get right to the meat of it, you'd be surprised how much quicker you grow. You can't live off of breast milk forever. At some point we have to graduate to other things, and then make space for the other children to get some breast milk, you see. But yeah, a lot of you are much further ahead than some of your so-called peers. And that requires a different responsibility on yourself now at this point. And I'm not trying to set up debates, nor am I trying to egotistically compare and say, well, we're better than this, we're better than trust me, I'm not trying to do that, because everyone knows something. Everyone has a quality to bring to the table. But I think Thursday was a great example of that. Sometimes you're much further than you realize. And stay humble. And through that humility, people will do what, people will underestimate you. I get it all the time, so it doesn't stop. But who cares? Who cares if someone who cares if someone thinks you don't know anything? It doesn't matter. You're not in it for them. At least you shouldn't be. You know what you know, and you know what you're doing, So again, I'm just going to give that to those who've been studying and riding along. Trust me, you're much further than you might think. All right. Until such time, this has been Chief Yuya. I look forward to hearing you all on Monday's community. Remember, it's the early wake up for community on Monday, 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. Tuesday, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Wednesday, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Thursday, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. and Friday, 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. Those are all Eastern times. All right. So I will speak to you soon.